And before introducing our speaker today, I'd like to have a couple of announcements about how this special event can take place. It's my pleasure to say that this special lecture is sponsored by first the international team of KAIST and also the Masters of Science Journalism program, and then also the Graduate School of Science and Technology Policy. And I'm also part of Graduate School of Science and Technology Policy. And it is my honor and pleasure to introduce very distinguished Professor Andrew Finberg. And probably you got some information about his biography from the poster and other places. I'd like to briefly mention what he has done so far. And Professor Andrew Finberg is Canada Research Chair in Philosophy of Technology in the School of Communication of Simon Fraser University. Among his research interests are philosophy of technology, critical theory, the internet, and Japanese intellectual history. He is the author of many books, including Transforming Technology, Questioning Technology, Alternative Modernity, Heidegger and Marcuse, and Between Reason and Experience, and co-author of When Poetry Ruled the Streets, and co-editor of Technology and the Politics of Knowledge, Modernity and Technology, and The Essential Marcuse. And he has taught in many places, including Duke University, San Diego State University, the University of Paris, the University of Brasilia, is that University of Brazil? Mm-hmm. and the University of Tokyo. And the second announcement I'd like to make is that he's going to give another talk, which is a public lecture tomorrow. It's going to be held in Creative Learning Building, room 401, and it's also open to everyone. And it's the contents will be a bit different, so that everybody can come and join. And please welcome.
Before we begin, two things. I would like to have some water. Oh, here it is. It materialized.
And do you need a slides?
No. I just wanted to show you my webpage. You can write down the address if you're curious. And if you look at the news, there's what happened? Oh. There's the lecture in a much longer, more complete form, so you could look at that if you're curious. Now, I think it's a good idea to turn this off so that I can see you. The light is so bright, I can see nothing. There. Okay.
Yeah, I have here some books like you, so that I have here two books. The first one is the Questioning Technology. The second one is the Between Reason and Experience, just published in MIT Press. And I have the one journal edited by Andrew. It is a special issue in the Information Society. So I will press them out, so you may just look at the books.
Also, I have two books, and so a sample of his books.
Okay, so I'm going to read this lecture, and then we can have a discussion afterward. It's called "The Mediation is the Message: Rationality and Agency in the Critical Theory of Technology." Critical theory of technology brings technology studies to bear on the social theory of rationality. This paper discusses this connection through a reconsideration of the contribution of the Frankfurt School to our understanding of what I call the paradox of rationality. That is, the fact that the promise of the Enlightenment has been disappointed as advances in scientific and technical knowledge have led to more and more catastrophic consequences. The challenge for critical theory is to develop this critique without romantic and anti-modern afterthoughts as a contribution to a progressive worldview. So the paper is divided into 3 parts, and the first part is entitled Rationality and the Critical Theory of Technology. In 1888, Edward Bellamy published Looking Backward, the most famous utopian novel of the 19th century. Bellamy's hero wakes up after sleeping for more than 100 years in a 20th century socialist society. All the institutions are explained to him as rational, that is, both just and efficient. Far from being regimented, Bellamy's socialist society is inhabited by highly developed and morally responsible individuals. In 1932, Aldous Huxley published Brave New World, the most famous dystopian novel of the 20th century. Huxley's heroes are persecuted nonconformists in another perfectly rational society. But this is a society of total administration. Huxley's dystopia has sacrificed justice and individuality to achieve stability and control. What happened to transform 19th century optimism into 20th century pessimism? Why did the 19th century foresee utopia and the 20th century dystopia? What transformed the meaning of rationality between these 2 centuries? Bellamy's utopia is organized around an industrial army in which workers enjoy equal pay. They are relieved of the most difficult and dangerous work by machines. The industrial army is commanded by experts of high moral character. If you fail to recognize the American banking community in this description, you will be surprised. Everyday life and politics are not organized by the army, nor is art, literature, science, invention, journalism, and religion. All these activities are pursued freely, without expert control, because they have no scientific basis, and hence no use for expert management. Bellamy's utopia is thus a bipolar society combining collectivism and individualism in ideal proportions. But this is precisely what did not happen in the 20th century, when the technical means were actually available to accomplish utopian ends.
Excuse me, what is ideal proportion? Collectivism, individualism, 50-50 or what? Sorry.
Well, I don't know. I wouldn't know how to quantify it. But the measure of whether it's ideal or not would be whether the economy is efficient and the human individuality free to develop. And if you can combine those 2 things, then you've done the job. So, and in Bellamy's utopia, it's perfect. Huxley's dystopia is also a rational society, extrapolated from mass manipulation by the emerging broadcast media and Ford's assembly line. His dystopia reconciles individual and society by eliminating individuality. Its rulers argue that all ills stem from the lack of fit between human capacities and the division of labor. Human beings must therefore be reconstructed in mind and body to suit the tasks they are condemned to perform. The alternative the novel proposes, or rather the dilemma it constructs, distinguishes total technology from individualistic chaos. The one offering slavery and stability, the other freedom and catastrophe. Both of these novels concern the radical consequences of social rationalization through technology. The comparison between them raises the question of the significance of rationality. For common sense, the rational is universal, necessary, and morally neutral. But in the one case, technical and moral progress are conjoined, while in the other, technology is bound up indissolubly with domination. In neither case is rationality the neutral medium in which independent desires and cultural impulses are transparently expressed. On the contrary, rationality is desire and culture in living social form. As my title indicates, with McLuhan-esque exaggeration, the rational mediation of social action biases the message or meaning of that action. In both novels, technology is simply posited in its perfection, leaving no room for posing the question of human agency in the technical sphere. But a new politics is emerging that is neither utopian nor dystopian. This politics responds to the breakdowns of rationality through democratic interventions by ordinary people, with consequences for the design of technologies and socio-technical systems. A new understanding of rationality is needed to respond to the questions raised by this emerging technical politics. My starting point in approaching these daunting issues is the critique of rationality in the Frankfurt School. Theodor Adorno, Max Horkheimer, and Herbert Marcuse argued that rationality is entangled in a paradox in modern times. Progress in technology, that is to say, rationality in its most concrete form, leads not to freedom, but to domination. The rational control of nature leads to the domination of some human beings by other human beings. A new elite arises to administer technically mediated institutions, and this is not accidental to modernity, an effect of corruption, prejudice, or interest, but responds to the requirements of efficiency. Thus, the division of modern societies into rulers and ruled is rooted in technological rationality itself. The factory was the first scene of rationalization as domination. Today it is everywhere apparent. The fate of medicine is a case in point. It has been transformed from a craft based on the individual labor of doctors and nurses into a vast technical system administered through bureaucratic institutions and increasingly controlled by corporations and governments. So these philosophers were disappointed Marxists. Marx had relied on the spread of rationality to eventually render the working class immune to the ideologies that kept it in thrall. But this had still not occurred by the time the Frankfurt School first flourished in the 1930s. On the contrary, these philosophers witnessed the rise of virulent racist and nationalist ideologies. They did not despair completely, but held out little hope for the future. The Frankfurt School reverses the notion we inherit from the 18th century Enlightenment, according to which domination is overcome through progress in rationality. On this view, domination should recede as rationalization advances. This is what Habermas calls the Enlightenment project, but it seems to be failing. The failure has led to two critiques of rationality. On the one hand, a romantic critique of reason itself calls for a retreat from rationality in all its works. On the other hand, various forms of critical theory propose a rational critique of rationality. These two styles of critique imply different politics, and it is therefore important to distinguish them clearly. Romantic resistance to reason as such begins in the late 18th century, accompanied by idealization of the past. Literature develops the romantic critique by opposing passion to bourgeois calculation and social conformism. The familiar image of life versus mechanism captures the essence of the romantic critique. It's wonderfully depicted in Charlie Chaplin's movie Modern Times, where he's caught finally in the gears of the mechanism. This romantic critique implies a rejection of modernity. This critique appears to be verified by the 20th century catastrophes of reason. Wars, concentration camps, nuclear weapons, and now environmental disaster threaten the Enlightenment project. But it is difficult to believe that the full content and significance of rationality is exhausted by these disasters. Surely reason has underexploited potentials that can be mobilized in a self-critical approach, such as the Frankfurt School's non-romantic critique of rationality. There are no ready concepts for talking about the paradox of rationality on these terms. The fact that the progress of technology has gone hand in hand with progress of domination. That the existing technology favors this development is clear. But critical theory rejects an essentialist critique of technology as such. To understand the paradox without romantic subtext, we need a concept of social bias appropriate for the analysis of rational systems. The Frankfurt School intended just such an analysis, but it failed to develop the categories and methods for performing it. For example, Marcuse followed phenomenology closely in arguing that modern scientific technical rationality is intrinsically linked to domination, and he advocated a new science and technology that would treat nature as a subject. But he also rejected any regression to a pre-modern qualitative method in the study of nature. What his reform of science and technology was to entail remains obscure. Critical theory needs a clear and consistent approach to the bias of technology. This is a departure from the usual concept of bias, which is closely associated with prejudice and discrimination in social relations. But bias, in a less familiar sense, appears in other spheres as well. Is the word bias familiar to everyone? It's not a mysterious concept, okay. For example, because right-handedness is prevalent, many everyday objects are adapted to right-handed use. This too could be called a bias, but it does not involve prejudice. Rather, it is built into the design of the objects themselves. In this, it resembles the kind of bias exhibited by technology and other rational systems. In accordance with this distinction, critical theory of technology identifies two types of bias, which I call substantive and formal bias. Enlightenment Critique addresses the more familiar substantive bias. 18th century philosophers were confronted with institutions that claimed legitimacy on the basis of stories about the past and religion. Rational Critique undermined these narrative myths behind feudalism. The Enlightenment judged according to facts and arguments, and this judgment was fatal to the Ancien Régime. Much later, a similar critique attacked racism and gender bias, again in the name of rational ethical principles and scientific knowledge. I call the bias criticized in such cases substantive because it is based on pseudo-facts and emotions, specific contents that motivate discrimination. For example, when women are thought to be less intelligent than men, a widely held view for which there is no evidence, even the smartest among them will have difficulty finding the jobs they deserve. Presumably they'll be replaced by less qualified men, who make for inefficiency in the operation of the economy. Substantive bias intrudes values and prejudices into domains that ought to be governed by rationality and justice. Critique of substantive bias therefore implies the purity of reason as such. But technology too discriminates between rulers and ruled in technologically mediated institutions. This bias does not involve prejudice. A biased technology is still rational in the sense that it links cause and effect efficiently. No narrative myths or pseudo-facts obstruct its functioning, and it is certainly free of emotion. Nevertheless, when working relationships are structured by technology in such a manner as to cause subordinates to perform mechanical and repetitive tasks with no role in managing the larger framework of their work, their subordination is technologically embedded. I call this a formal bias because it does not violate the formal norms, such as control and efficiency, under which technology is developed and employed. It doesn't concern the ends and goals, but just the formal properties of technology. In this respect, the formal bias of technology is similar to the bias of the market, which was the starting point for Marx's critique of capitalism. The market appears rational, but strangely, equal exchange leads to inequality. This inequality escapes Enlightenment critique because it is not justified by narrative myths, but by the exchange of equivalents. In the mid-19th century, two styles of critique emerged in response. The French anarchist philosopher Proudhon famously claimed that property is theft. In his theory, the market is treated as a fraud rather than as a coherent system. Marx was a more rigorous thinker. He realized that the critique of the market would have to begin with the fact of equal exchange rather than denying it. The origin of inequality would have to be found in the very rationality of the market. He proved this with an elaborate economic theory that I will not review here. The basic idea is that workers are paid what they are worth on the terms of the capitalist market exchange, but produce a surplus under the capitalist management of work. The problem is not primarily the unfairness of this system, but the larger consequences of capitalist management of the economy. With this argument, Marx showed that rational systems can be biased, and he extended this type of critique to technology as well. The methodological significance of Marx's analysis lies in combining the apparently contradictory notions of rationality and bias. This was precisely what the Frankfurt School was to do much later in its critique of technology. The point of that critique was not to blame technology for social ills, nor to appeal to technological rationality as an antidote to the inefficiency of capitalism, the standard Marxist view, but to show how technology had been adapted to an oppressive system. There are two familiar ways in which rational systems and artifacts are biased. In the first place, they may require a context for their implementation, and that context may have different implications for different individuals and groups. Consider the case of maps. A map may be a perfect representation of the territory, and in that sense highly rational, but it may also embody a social bias. For example, in the case of early navigation, when map-making was a necessary preliminary to the conquest of territory occupied by natives who themselves had no need of maps to get around. The second way in which rational artifacts are biased is through their design, as in the case of right-handed tools, or the market in Marx's theory. Artifacts and systems reflect particular interests through the role of powerful actors in shaping design. This does not make them irrational or inefficient, but on the contrary, is the way in which they are rational. I employ the concepts of translation and design code to understand this apparent paradox. Technologies are built according to a design code lying at the intersection of social demand and natural causality. Technical design codes translate social discourses as design specifications. The sidewalk ramp is a good example. You know what a ramp is, right? It's a slope. The sidewalk ramp is a good example. Until it was introduced, disability was a private problem. The interests of the disabled were not represented in the design of sidewalks, which obstructed their movement at every crossing. But once society accepted responsibility for the free movement of the disabled, the design of sidewalks translated the new right. This recognition takes the form of a design specification that allows wheelchairs to get down to the street and back up on the sidewalk. But that's simply a technical specification and a request for proposals to construction companies. Progress is defined relative to design codes and not in absolute terms. Take commercial aircraft as an example. The criterion of progress in this domain has shifted from speed, the Concorde, to size, the 747, as a function of OPEC's power to raise the price of fuel. Neither size nor speed is the right criterion of progress in this case. There's no question of rightness because the outcome is contingent on shifting historical events. Unsuccessful alternatives are rejected and forgotten. The last time I saw a Concorde, it was sitting as a kind of ornament on a lawn on the exit from the Charles de Gaulle airport in Paris. So an unsuccessful alternative is rejected. It's covered over by a kind of unconsciousness that makes it seem as though the chosen path of progress was inevitable and necessary all along. This is what gives rise to the illusion of pure rationality. That illusion obscures the imagination of future alternatives by granting existing technology and rationalized social arrangements an appearance of universal universality and necessity they cannot legitimately claim. Critical theory demystifies this appearance to open up the future. It is neither utopian nor dystopian, but situates rationality within the political, where its consequences are a challenge to human responsibility. So now part 2. This is called Constructivism, Critical Theory, and Communication. The Frankfurt School's responses to the failure of the Enlightenment faith in reason was a dialectic of enlightenment that recognized the catastrophe of modernity, but also the promise of a rational society based on freedom from myth and domination. The most significant application of this dialectic was to the development of mass society. The Frankfurt School's critique presupposed Kant's ideal of autonomous critical individuality, which Marx had projected onto the working class as class consciousness. But propaganda and advertising have succeeded in mobilizing whole populations through nationalism, racism, and consumerism. This is the new mechanism of control. At the basis of the new system is the extension of the commodity form to culture. Art used to have its own canons and logic based on religious or artistic traditions. The sale of the work did not affect its inner form as profoundly as it does in the case of contemporary commodified cultural products. These products communicate a conformist ideology through stereotyped characters, plots, and images. A new authoritarianism emerges in which accepting the facts established by power appears as the only rational response to reality. And if you need to learn how to accept the facts, just watch television. It'll show you. This is the rationalization of consciousness itself. The thought of the Frankfurt School was elaborated during a long period of defeats for the left. Broadcasting and technical macro systems offered a dystopian paradigm of technology in this period. There is a large dose of truth in these philosophers' pessimistic conclusions, despite the evident exaggeration, but their critique of technology is limited by this historical context. Today it appears abstract and technophobic, and as a result it is frequently dismissed. It's a typical straw man in cultural studies texts. The Frankfurt School, the manipulation thesis. Obviously false. Yeah, right. Just look at the current electoral campaign in the United States and see what you make of it from the standpoint of cultural studies. New struggles around technology cast a different light on the theory. Environmental struggles, user agency on the internet and in medicine, and economic and technical struggles in developing countries all testify to the fact that the masses have not been incorporated completely into the system. These struggles are not always political in a traditional sense, but they refute the dystopian tendency of critical theory. Unfortunately, critical theory in both its early formulations and in the recent work of Habermas and his followers ignores agency in the technical sphere. As a result, it remains caught in a dystopianism appropriate to the age of broadcasting, even as the internet creates a new social and technical context. For this reason, I have turned to social constructivist approaches to technology, which do emphasize the role of agency in technical development. The term social constructivism refers to several related approaches in science and technology studies. They have in common a rejection of the positivist notion that scientific theory and technical progress are products of pure rational understanding of nature. Constructivists emphasize the social character of science and technology, not to the exclusion of rationality, but as its context and medium. Although social constructivism is not a political theory, it has political implications. Its critique of positivism and determinism undermine technocratic ideology and modernization theory. Placing it in the context of critical theory brings out these political implications. In the 1980s, social constructivism inspired new approaches to technology studies. Some of the major figures in this trend are Trevor Pinch, Viva Biker, and Bruno Latour, who I hope you've all they're assigned in your courses. Traditional sociology rejected the notion of social explanation of technology. Progress in efficiency was viewed as an exogenous source of social change. For social constructivist technology studies, on the contrary, technical choices like scientific theories are underdetermined by purely technical criteria. Technology is socially shaped, not rationally determined by pure efficiency, as in traditional deterministic accounts. Social constructivist technology studies attempts to identify the relevant actors engaged with the design process. These actors define a given state of affairs as a technical problem for which they seek a technical solution. But problem definitions are relative to actors' interests and concerns. This is called the interpretative flexibility of artifacts. It is especially important in the early stages of the development of an artifact. As Pinch and Biker explain, the interpretation of an artifact influences not just its use, but also its very design. In this sense, technology is socially relevant. But missing in most constructivist accounts are the irrelevant actors who lack the power to interpret and influence design decisions. This describes the entire underlying population in Marxist accounts of the development of the industrial system and the Frankfurt School's account of the mass media. The absence of these non-actors from constructivist accounts is problematic. Constructivists have also shied away from invoking diffuse influences such as ideology and culture that are essential to understanding politics. Thus, constructivist insights must be supplemented by other methods to gain a full picture of the significance of technology. This is certainly the case with the Internet, a technology that is still at an early stage in its development. The Internet illustrates the basic constructivist point that technologies are not things, but processes, contingent on shifting interpretations as well as knowledge of nature. Since the Internet is not a finished product, but is still incomplete and evolving, it is impossible to fix its nature once and for all, and to praise or damn it for qualities it may very well modify or lose in the near future. Hence the pointlessness of much of the hype and demystification circulating among scholars and journalists who write about the Internet. The history of the Internet reveals the complexity of the relations between technology and politics. Originally called ARPANET, it was developed by the Pentagon for time sharing on mainframe computers. It was intended to ameliorate scientific communication for defense with an information exchange and calculating service. The key to its later evolution was the selection of an unusual method for processing data. Telephone companies controlled their networks by managing data flows on central computers. But the Internet protocol required every computer attached to the system to manage its own data. No centralized control over the system was necessary or possible. Frequent user innovation has been an unanticipated consequence of this approach. The Internet went public in the 1980s, and the web made it popular in the 1990s. At this point, the scientific model of free information exchange came into conflict with corporate interests, while all sorts of communicative applications developed rapidly on the now public Internet. This multiplicity of actors and their interpretations yields alternative models of the Internet, none of which has yet achieved closure. So some people thought the Internet was for finding data, other people thought it was for making money, and other people thought it was finding dates. The various interpretations of these are different problems and they imply different technical solutions. The various interpretations of the Internet reflect ideologies, conceptions of society. The struggle between them implies different social visions, ultimately different ways of life embodied in design, not simply different uses of the same technology. Three coexisting models compete and complement each other today on the Internet. An information model stems from the original actors in the scientific community. The consumption model responds to the needs of business. A community model introduced by lay users has transformed the internet into an innovative social phenomenon. Under the policy of network neutrality, no one type of data can be privileged and given extra bandwidth at the expense of other types. This has prevented powerful actors in business from turning the internet into another broadcast medium at the expense of its communicative functions. The significance of the community model appears clearly in the light of the Frankfurt School's critique of the mass media. The essential point of that critique was the effectiveness of broadcasting in promoting a consensus favorable to the ruling interests. The internet weakens consensus by introducing unconventional viewpoints and making them visible to a large audience at no cost. The internet revives a public sphere of discussion and debate, more nearly resembling the public sphere that existed before broadcasting. The manifestations of creativity on the internet have led to new ideas about intellectual property, most effectively implemented by the free and open source software community. The emergence of large online communities has empowered their members on occasion to protest and enact their own vision of their rights. This has a particular relevance to other technological issues. The internet connects scattered users and victims of the vast technical systems that underlie modern societies. Environmental campaigns employ the internet to build constituencies affected by pollution and other problems. In the medical domain, we have seen communities of patients organized to demand increased research funding and access to experimental treatments. The internet thus has a unique and still largely untapped democratic potential. Perhaps the most important manifestation of that potential to date is the defense of the internet by its own users. This is democratic intervention for the sake of democratic communication. The democratic applications of the internet have implications for the theme of rationality and domination explored by the Frankfurt School. The first-generation Frankfurt School theorists had no solution to the problems they posed, although Marcuse did suggest the possibility of a new emancipatory science and technology. Habermas, that's the second generation, sought a more practical solution in the realm of communication, but he abstracted completely from the technical basis of modern life. The politics of the internet and the agency of technical users and victims signifies the existence of another alternative. Technology is now at the center of a new kind of politics. While it is still commonplace to dismiss public protest as irrelevant, regressive, and ideological, expertise tends to obliterate its own history, forgetting the often popular origins of its current technical standards. Now, in a period of rapid change in technology, the background is coming to the fore. It is clear that public influence on technology is not an extraordinary external intrusion into an autonomous technical sphere, but rather it is an intrinsic aspect of the dynamics of technical development. The technical sphere must be redefined to include the experience of users and victims, as well as the knowledge of experts. Technology is not simply a matter of artifacts, but as Latour has argued, it involves networks of individuals and things held together by various types of associations. In some cases, the presence of the network is obvious. For example, a factory or a hospital organized around the technologies that mediate the individual's activities. In other cases, a latent group may be constituted in response to the network's unintended side effects. This describes, for example, the experience of victims of pollution or unsafe foodstuffs, mobilized once they discover the source of the problems they share. As members of networks, individuals acquire what I call participant interests that are more or less well represented by the technical codes presiding over the network's design. Foucault's concept of subjugated knowledges reflects the experience of those who are poorly represented. They possess a different perspective from the top-down view. This perspective can inform resistances based on interests slighted by the dominant design. Insofar as technical codes are more or less representative in this sense, they are political, and interventions by actors into their formulation are political interventions. Where struggles yield new meanings that feed back into technological development, they affect design and technical disciplines. In such cases of public action around technological issues, rationality and values come together in the incorporation of interests into revised technical codes. So that's the example of sidewalk ramps as a perfect case in point. The conclusion of the argument over rationality is neither relativist nor absolutist, but instead involves interaction and dialogue between reason and experience, technical disciplines, and everyday life. The effect of these interventions is to limit the autonomy of experts and to translate new values into regulations and codes. This is what I call democratic rationalization. The term is an apparent oxymoron. Rationalization comes from Max Weber's theory, right? In Weber, rationalization means calculation and control, and is implicitly linked to top-down management and administration. Weber assumed uncritically that organization in a modern society requires strict regulation from above. By excluding democratic or cooperative control a priori, he condemned developed societies to an iron cage. But democratic rationalizations bend the bars of the cage.
Could you give one more example of oxymoron?
An oxymoron would be a contradiction in terms.
Good grief.
Good grief.
Happy sorrow.
Yeah.
John Bush, right?
I remember that. So we must generalize beyond Weber's concept to a view of rationalization that does not prejudge the future. This generalized notion of rationalization would still refer to optimizing means through calculation and innovation, but it would not imply a tyrannical system of control. A different type of rational society is possible, based on mutual discipline and democratic leadership. This possibility sheds light on the increasingly common interventions from below. In one sense, this could be seen as a generalization from Marx's approach to class struggle. Marx, too, anticipated technological change under a socialist system in which the workers who use technology would also determine its future. The early Frankfurt School's approach to technology corresponded to the Marxist critique of political economy in demystifying the biases of the prevailing technological rationality. Today we can extend and concretize that approach in a critical theory of technology. And so this brings me to the third part, which is about Habermas and the communication technology. System and life world in instrumentalization theory. In this final section, I present my own approach, which I call instrumentalization theory, in a critical confrontation with Jürgen Habermas, the most prominent contemporary representative of the Frankfurt School. Habermas introduced communication theory and system theory into critical theory and turned it away from the radical critique of modernity toward the reform of the welfare state. Habermas rejects what he considers the anti-modernism of Adorno, Horkheimer, and Marcuse. Their critique of social domination is based on a more fundamental critique of the domination of nature. But Adorno and Horkheimer never explain the critical standard underlying their argument, nor do they propose a concrete program of reform of modern society. Furthermore, Habermas claims the very concept of domination of nature is incoherent and implies a critique of technology as such, not so very different from what one finds in Heidegger. Habermas found Marcuse's attempts to go beyond these limitations unconvincing. According to Habermas, there is a gaping normative deficit in the philosophy of the early Frankfurt School. In his 1968 essay on technology and science as ideology, Habermas takes up a part of Marcuse's argument, the notion that the problem with technology is its universalization as a worldview or ideology influencing every aspect of life in modern society. This is Marcuse's critical version of the technology thesis, according to which experts have taken over and depoliticized public life. Self-expanding technology replaces moral considerations and debate. Habermas finds in this approach a way of separating the critique of technology as such, which he rejects as romantic and anti-modern, from the critique of the legitimating function of technology in technocratic ideology. Habermas develops his own version of this argument in the course of a critical confrontation with Marxism. Where Marx discussed productive forces and relations of production and identified the tensions between them that motivate class struggle, Habermas argues that class struggle has weakened in intensity to the point where Marxist theory must be completely revised. The tensions Marx addressed must now be explained through an analysis of the types of action underlying the original Marxist categories. He replaces those categories with new generic categories referring to individual action orientations. Habermas thus substitutes the concepts of purposive rational action and communicative interaction for Marx's forces and relations of production. Purposive rational action is success and control oriented. The rational relation to nature is rational in this, the technical relation to nature is rational in this sense. So the forces of production come under this category. It differs from communicative interaction, which aims at mutual understanding rather than technical success. The generic tension between the types of action involved in work and social relations now replaces the original Marxian problematic. Habermas identifies two major features of all societies on the basis of these distinctions. On the one hand, every society has an institutional framework based on systems of meanings, practices, and expectations established by communicative interaction. On the other hand, there are technical subsystems which contain the knowledge, practices, and artifacts that enable the society to produce the goods required for survival. The balance between the technical and communicative dimensions varies, but the institutional framework was always predominant until modern times. Habermas distinguishes two stages in the development of modernity, in each of which a different technical subsystem intrudes on the institutional framework. In the first phase of bourgeois society, the market penetrates everywhere and displaces the institutional framework as the determining instance of social life. The legitimacy of the ruling interests is established through their identification with the laws of the market. This legitimation fades as governments begin to regulate markets in the 20th century. In the post-war period, technology takes over where the market leaves off in organizing more and more of social life, and market legitimation gives way to technological legitimation. Legitimation is now achieved by identifying the ruling interests with the efficient functioning of the system. Depolitization masks continuing domination and justifies a technocratic order. In his later work, Habermas develops an improved version of this theory. He realizes that individual action orientations do not a society make. The real problem is coordination among many acting subjects. Habermas distinguishes two different types of action coordination, characterizing the domains of life world and system. These now replace the institutional framework and technical subsystems of his earlier work. In the new theory, coordination is achieved in both domains, but in different ways, through mutual understanding in the life world and through systems such as the market, without much in the way of communicative interaction. The life world is essential to the reproduction of the individuals, but it is incapable of managing the institutions of a large-scale modern society. For that purpose, more impersonal and quasi-mechanical forms of interaction are supplied by systems of economic exchange and administration. These systems are self-regulating and require no collective agreement, but only stripped down and conventional responses such as the typical dialogue involved in making a purchase. Modern societies depend on the effectiveness of systems at unburdening the life world of excessively complicated tasks. Technocracy is now redefined as colonization of the life world by the system. The outcome depicted in Brave New World threatens, but unlike Huxley, Habermas does not despair. He advocates increased social control of the system in terms of a consensus reached freely in the public sphere through communicative acts. He thus revives the bipolar vision of society and looking backward. Habermas's dualism has interesting implications. He argues that modern societies operate in two main worlds: a world of quasi-mechanical institutional interactions and a world structured around meanings and communicative understanding. Each world requires its own method of analysis. But unfortunately, there is an ambiguity in Habermas's application of this dualistic conception. In methodological discussions, he tends to argue that the distinction is analytic. This means that system rationality and life world coexist in all social institutions. That would be the nature of an analytic distinction. Sociologists who study organizations find this overlap in the dependence of formal structures on informal relationships, both of which are necessary to effective functioning. Similarly, economists who study the effects of taxation on incentives for spouses to work illustrate the penetration of system rationality into the family, an institution that is primarily the scene of communicative interaction. But it is not easy to apply the colonization thesis on this interpretation, since system and life world are always already interpenetrating each other. How does one colonize the other? Habermas evades this question by tacitly identifying system and life world with separate institutions, such as the economy and the family. But this risks neutralizing the system as a sphere of pure rationality. It's no longer social. The market, for example, appears to be a self-regulating system based on economic relations rather than social choices. It can be limited from the outside, but within its range it operates according to its own laws. Similarly, technology can be employed for one or another socially determined purpose, but its workings and developmental path seem to be science-based rather than socially based. Such a view of systems has conservative consequences. The communicative sphere has only an instrumental relation to the separate systems and cannot redesign them from the ground up without violating their internal logic. This is what Habermas would call de-differentiating society. It's regressive, back to the Middle Ages. To escape these problems, it is necessary to stick rigorously to the idea that system and life world are a cross-cutting analytic distinction throughout all the institutions of modern society. Only then is the theory adequate to the task of understanding and criticizing formal bias. I therefore propose what I call a double aspect theory of systems, according to which they are traversed by the social conditions of their design and configuration. Life world and system are not social spheres, but overlapping perspectives on the social world. Such a theory can encompass technology along with the markets and administrations analyzed by Habermas. I call this approach Instrumentalization Theory. In this theory, the causal aspect of the system level is called the primary instrumentalization, and its social dimension, the secondary instrumentalization. As applied to technology, the point of the distinction is to show the relation between two fundamental aspects of every functional artifact: causal structure and life-worldly significance. The primary instrumentalization is an imaginative relation to the technical affordances of natural objects. It functionalizes the object. Functionalization involves decontextualizing elements of nature in order to isolate their useful properties. The decontextualization is accompanied by a reduction of the object to just those aspects to which it can be incorporated into a device. Every technical insight involves these operations, by which a natural object enters the social world through its practical affordances. Grasping a stick in order to extend one's reach to a fruit hanging from a high branch is a very simple example. The action depends on causal perceptions and reasoning. Modern technology assembles huge numbers of such affordances in coherent patterns to accomplish goals that go beyond any individual's needs. The logic of such assemblages is not exclusively technical. It is constrained by causal principles. Only an assemblage that works is built. But there are an infinite number of working combinations available. The secondary instrumentalization determines which ones are realized. They cannot simply remain in the form of a bright idea about affordances, but must be brought within the scope of the system of meanings that make up the way of life of the society. This opens up some possible designs and forecloses others. The reduction of the object, which strips it bare of connections, is compensated too, as its design is mediated by ethical and aesthetic values. This is the life-worldly significance of the technical. It situates artifacts in the way of life to which they belong. Technological design combines both levels seamlessly, and both are necessary. Apart from the simplest technical actions, the construction of a device is always a social act involving a secondary instrumentalization. The instrumentalization theory offers a framework within which to analyze the imbrication of the technological system and life world. The two instrumentalizations refer to different aspects of artifacts and their users, but these are aspects only, not separate spheres able to exist independently of each other. This is crucial. Unlike Habermas's system and life world, here the aspects are only analytically distinguished, each reflecting the other on its own terms. The fact that modern societies are able to abstract the functional level of artifacts and to construct technical disciplines on that basis masks this essential social dimension. The abstraction certainly has consequences. It makes modern technology possible, but it does not actually eliminate the social. Recall the example of the sidewalk ramp discussed earlier. The ramp's causal properties are describable on purely technical terms in a specification, but that specification also represents the rights of the disabled technically. That is its significance in the life world. Social criticism must address the design and configuration of technical systems. The instrumentalization theory offers a critical approach to technology without technophobia. It uncovers the politics of design and concretizes the connection between the domination of nature and the domination of human beings on which the first generation of the Frankfurt School focused. But it also identifies the breaking points at which technologies can be reconfigured to serve democratic purposes. Okay, so that's the end.
And now floor is open and it's going to go to questions.
Thanks for your excellent presentation. I'm just wondering how the East Asian intellectuals or socialists or philosophers respond or accept your new critical theory of technology, because they live in a very different world. And I think your analysis of the rationalities or technology are based on Western societies, Western history. And we are living in a very different world.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, one of the words you employ in this paper most often is the rationalities. But when the English word or West German or French word translated into Chinese word, for Chinese, Koreans, and Japanese, I think its meaning also changed a little bit.
Well,
I'll give you another example. So
how?
You mentioned Huxley's Brave New World.
Yeah.
I read it when I was young.
Yeah.
And the movie, Brave New World, was broadcast in, I think, in the late 1970s or early 1980s,
Yes.
when the military government ruled South Korea.
Uh-huh.
So I believe Brave New World was not for many Koreans or East Asians, but did not always mean dystopia. as you described.
What, you mean it looked better than the existing military
Yes.
dictatorship?
At least.
And there are many good points. So my point is that your description or your analysis or your argument are almost wholly depend on your experience as a Westerner. And I'm just wondering whether the critical theory of technology and how East Asians accept or respond to your critical theory of technology.
Well, I guess I'd be willing to believe that the presentation that I made relies very heavily on Western experience. Perhaps dystopia and utopia are not categories that have any basis in Asian culture. Although I find that hard to believe. But it's possible that there's just no resonance in those terms. But rationality is not up for grabs. I mean, there's no... Chinese people, Korean people can't decide what rationality is. We know what it is institutionally because we have scientific disciplines, we have technical disciplines, we have administrative codes, and those are implemented very much in very similar ways, not identical, but very similar ways all over the world. So the word rationality refers to those systems. And those systems have similar consequences everywhere. So I don't see how this is an effect of, global civilization. I don't see how it could be so remote from the experience of Koreans. You have a government, it has a bureaucratic structure, orders are passed down the chain of command. As they go down, people, they deviate as best they can, they try and protect themselves. They do exactly the same things people do in the United States or in England. I don't see that there's a fundamental difference with technology, right? We're in a building that's built according to principles that are shared by Western and Eastern technical cultures. So I'm not sure. And also you have the same kind of protests. I was told today about the mad cow protests. People are suspicious of technology in the same way. Is it really so different?
I think what you suggested is still reflecting the westernized idea which want to be modernized. I think the people, the East Asian peoples wanted to be modernized, and in the sense they want to such a system, and I think it is not reflecting the Korean culture and Eastern culture. Still, it cannot reflect the Eastern culture.
I will give you my answers during the dinner.
One more thing I could say is that I certainly understand that the problem of technology looks very different in a developing country than in a developed one. In a developing country, the benefits stand out, and the disadvantages seem small in comparison. In a developed country, people are much more conscious of the risks and dangers. So pollution looks okay if the alternative is to be, barely getting enough food back on the farm, right? So sure, pollution, why not? I mean, it's a minor problem compared to starvation. But once you have several generations of life in a developed context, then pollution looks like a big problem. And in fact, it gets a lot worse because there's so many more people polluting. So you have to confront it. And the same is true of administrative control, you know. The degree of regimentation that the Chinese government is able to impose on the population is very high. But many people may consider that regimentation useful. Because, for example, they can rebuild after the earthquake very quickly. Whereas, you know, in Italy, after an earthquake, 50 years later, people still wonder, where's the money? You know? It's all been stolen by the politicians and the mafia. So the rebuilding never happens. In China, it happens right away. So that's good. But on the other hand, this high degree of regimentation suppresses people's individual freedom. And they, at some point, when the challenge of the basic developmental challenges have been met, that side effect is going to appear very big in people's minds. And they won't be as easily accepting of regimentation. So I think that I would agree. There is a difference in perspective. But I think we're rapidly reaching the point of convergence, even in that area.
Well, thank you for your talk. First, I would like to say that I really enjoyed reading your paper with Maria Bakaldieva, Nuclear Implication of the Internet, and that actually is connected to your talk today, I think. My question is about the strength of Habermasian conceptualization of life world and the system. I mean, I agree to your critique against Habermas, but the strength of Habermas, I think, is it really pinpoints what aspects of technology can be criticized, the one which will colonize sort of the interaction or communication or the, let's say, the life world kind of aspects. If that is endangered by any parts of technology, which that can be criticized according to Habermasian understanding of technological system, I think. Yeah. On the other hand, according to your understanding, I think that we do have these instrumentalization processes which first decontextualize and then second sort of specifically contextualize into selective values and ethics. And to apply critiques to the second process of instrumentalization, we have to have some standards of values and ethics to criticize the processes, right? So whose values and ethics should be regarded as good values and ethics to, you know, connect those decontextualized technology?
So, okay, you make 2 points that are in defense of Habermas, but let me criticize them. The problem of boundaries, that's what Habermas is interested in. The boundary of the system, right? Confine it within its proper place so that it doesn't overflow into the life world. That's the way he thinks about the problem. So he's critical where, for example, the family is subverted by legal intrusions into family life that are inappropriate, right? But that leaves untouched the market, the production system. He doesn't say, for example, that economic production has been colonized by the system. Economic production, he accepts the way it is as the normal way it should be. But then if somebody says, well, what about the possibility of democratic control, some kind of democratic control of management? His response is that's de-differentiating. That's an inappropriate intrusion of the life world into the system. But I think that democratic control of management is a good thing. I would like to defend that idea. And I have no basis for defending it in Habermas. And this is because design is not part of it. Right? He doesn't have a theory of design. There's no... Now, I would like to use the concept of formal bias to be able to argue against even the most efficient operation of a dictatorial management process. the fact that it is efficient, that it is doing its thing in system terms, is no excuse, because its configuration as a system embodies values, and those values can be challenged and contested, and other values would lead to a different design that would be efficient too, in its own way. So that's why I don't think the Habermasian argument for colonization is successful. So as for the second point, Habermas does offer a theoretical grounding for some basic principles, moral principles. But these, the theoretical grounding is so abstract that it doesn't determine any particular technological situation. I mean, it's, for example, obviously from his moral theory, recognition of other human beings' rights is essential. But your rights are recognized by an employer who employs you, even if you're paid very little. Well, on what basis can you protest? Not a Habermasian basis, right? You'd have to find some other basis on which to protest. So, and this is generally the problem of Kantian moral theories, that they operate at such an abstract level that they really don't address concrete situations. So, of course, it's not useless. I mean, slavery, for example, is excluded by Habermas's theory. But wage labor is not excluded or in any way challenged by it. So, if you want to challenge a system based on wage labor, you need another approach. So the other part of my answer would be social movements where you can see there's another way to ethics, not from the top down, but from the bottom up, where you can see protests that emerge from the failure to represent interests and rights of ordinary people. You can there argue that this is an important ethical advance, that this stands, for example, in the case of wheelchairs and sidewalk ramps. Right? This was not derived from ethical theory, it came from protests of individuals. So, and then it's true, we can reconstruct after the fact in Habermasian fashion the rationale. In that case, it's a matter of right, of moral right. So it's easy to use Habermasian terms to reconstruct those protests. But in many cases, what people are protesting is not about rights, but about interests. For example, the introduction of communication to the internet and the defense of communication against business, which wants to get rid of network neutrality and turn the whole thing into a big television. That's rooted in an interest. It's very difficult, I think, to argue on a purely rights-based standard that people should have the right. Why should they have the right to communicate with each other on the internet? You know, why? So you need other ways of thinking that are more bottom-up, I think, in order to... That's why I think Foucault's theories are interesting and useful for the purpose of developing the democratic critique of technology.
See, on the second page, my starting point in approaching these daunting issues, you call it daunting issues. Is it that daunting? Because I was wondering.
Well, if you think it's easy, then you are a very powerful person. The issue of rationality in modern society and how to criticize it, the problem of domination in modern society, and how it relates to the democratic promise of the Enlightenment. These seem to me daunting. I try my best, but I don't promise much.
But not many people, not many scholars touched upon this.
There's been quite a bit of reflection in the last 30, 40 years on the fact that we're not getting what we bargained for from all this rationalization process. That we're not getting the liberation that we expected. We're not getting the good life. Something else is happening. So, in different ways, different writers have tried to understand why the outcome is so different from the promise. Yeah.
Professor Fisher.
Can I just ask, really for my own, to help my own understanding of this? You said that we can't rely on something like consciousness to raise the individual or a group to the situation which they can challenge the kind of embodied rationality of technology. Okay, can you tell us more about the process, what the process is? And you've talked about the individual. Okay, well, can you tell us a bit more about how that process works?
Well, I don't have a like Marx's. There's no chapter in my work which explains how it's all going to end. I think that would be very daring. But I think what we can observe is a shift from passive acceptance of expert administration, of technocratic administration, to much more contestation and conflict around technical issues, and the emergence of varieties of solutions. The issues are in the newspaper every day, right? All you have to do is open the newspaper, and there are technical problems being discussed. The technology is entering the public sphere. And that's an amazing phenomenon, if you have any historical perspective.
Sure.
So then the question is, what does it add up to? Well, at the very least, it probably adds up to no brave new world. But I think in a sense, you could say that what Marx did was to extrapolate from the first version of technical politics, which was working class resistance to the organization of the factory and the Industrial Revolution. He argued from that to a general democratic control of technology, which he understood to be production technology. Okay. Well, that didn't pan out. That hasn't happened. Today, what we have is technology is everywhere, in every institution, and not just in the factory. And we have little contestations, maybe not so different from early working class movements.
Grassroots.
Yeah. But from the kind of contestations we have today, it's difficult to identify a single unified subject that could act historically in a revolution like the French Revolution or the Russian Revolution, since we don't have a grip on the future the way Marx thought he did. On the other hand, we do have this really epic-making change, which brings technology into the domain of politics for the first time.
Would it change with different kinds of technology? We've talked about the web.
Yes.
As one example. Perhaps there are other examples as well.
Sure.
Similar kind of process.
I think medicine is a good place to look for examples, because medicine organizes the lives of millions of people. And those people are now reading about their disease on the internet. They go into the doctor with a printout. They organize on the internet to pressure the government into spending money on their disease, or to stop vaccinating their children, because of course democracy also leads to foolishness and mistakes as well as the good things. So that's a democratic tendency, and there was one really very important, historically important movement that's been well documented. And that was the movement of AIDS patients for access to experimental treatment in the 1980s. And that was a political movement around medicine, right? And they organized, because they didn't use the internet, but they had a political network already. people didn't require the internet to get political. It's just that it makes it easier for dispersed groups to coalesce. But they're the only group of patients who were able to really organize before the internet, because they already had a political network based on their civil rights struggles. And so they deployed that then in the medical sphere. And that was astounding. And that's one of the big influences on my theoretical conception, is that movement.
Professor, I'm still wondering whether your democratic rationalization, whether that's a description of what have happened, or what can happen, or what should happen.
Mm-hmm.
It's always a little bit confusing in your work that you always give these examples here and there, but sometimes I wonder whether that can be those occasions can be occasions that can be generalized. Now the technology is globalizing, and you also mentioned when you talk about social constructivists, there are irrelevant actors. I think in our technological society there are more irrelevant actors who are only influenced but has no voice.
Yes.
So I can agree that it is possible that democratic rationalization can happen at some degree, at some place, but I wonder whether they could overcome the problems that was pointed out by these pessimistic thinkers.
Yeah, that's a good question. First of all, there's no way to really predict what will happen. We know that there will be occasional struggles, public struggles, around issues involving technology, and that these struggles will often have significant effects on policy, on design, on innovation. But we don't know if these struggles will become so general and so frequent that they will eventually transform the society. Say, for example, produce some new version or equivalent of what we conceived as a democratic socialist society. We don't know if this is possible. But I have a different way of looking at it. When things are ubiquitous, you don't think about them anymore, right? It's so obvious that the purpose of the internet is for us to send emails and go onto Facebook that no one thinks about how strange that is, how odd it is that happened. That this tool that was invented for time sharing on mainframe computers by the American military should end up as a device for us to communicate. This is truly odd. And so history, of course, is full of strangenesses like that, right? But you tend to sort of smooth it out. When you look back, it seems that, well, it's obvious that this is what it had to become, but it isn't obvious at all. And it became this way through interventions that were not planned by the Pentagon. The first email program on the internet was put on there for fun by an engineer who was working on the project, a young engineer who just thought it'd be fun. There was a file transfer program, and he just tweaked it a little, and it turned into an email program. Instant messaging was first widely used in France before the internet, and it was introduced by hackers. It wasn't part of the system, but there was on one system, there was a way for the system administrators to send a message to everyone who was on, and somebody hacked into it and used it to send messages. And then pretty soon, everyone in France was sending messages to each other. And this system, which was invented for information age distribution of knowledge to the population to make them ready to participate in a postmodern, post-industrial society, right? Suddenly turned into an electronic singles bar. So this kind of phenomenon, you see, has such huge implications that it becomes invisible. And I think occasional interventions like this are going to happen, whether or not the system evolves into some radically different system. These kinds of interventions will continue to happen. And they shape the environment on a scale that's so out of proportion to the power of the individuals who initiate the changes that they're taken for granted afterwards.
Professor, I'm reading the biography of Oppenheimer.
Yes.
Now, this I think this nuclear weapon was one of the trigger that shocked many philosophers of technology at the time. And now, that's that kind of disaster, like atomic bomb, that was made only by expertise in isolated places, and they planned it, and they made it, and it's still managed by a small number of expertise.
Thank goodness.
Yeah. It seems that there is no way for individuals to intrude into the management of this kind of things.
But that's not historically accurate. The first people who made the bomb were scientists and technicians who were sworn to secrecy. But they were also citizens of the United States. At least most of them were. And as citizens, they felt they had responsibilities distinct from their technical role in performing this military task. So the first thing they tried to do was to stop the bombing of Japan through a petition that circulated only among people who were on the secret. Then after the war, they decided that they had to inform the public so the public could express its opinion. And so they organized magazines, they gave speeches, and eventually it took a very long time for people to understand that they were threatened by the bomb. That it wasn't just they who were threatening others, but it was a two-way street. When this view finally was prevalent, then disarmament became popular. So, of course, it's true that the bomb was always controlled by a very small military and scientific elite. What to do with it was subject to public pressures, and those pressures came from below. The governments were not interested in disarmament. There were movements of people, demonstrations, petitions, and opinion polls began to show that people wanted disarmament. And so there were negotiations. That's the political basis of the treaties, the SALT treaties, the nuclear test ban. I was part of the nuclear test ban. The test ban was put into effect because nuclear testing in the United States was sending fallout all over the country. And a biologist in St. Louis, where I spent most of my childhood, collected the baby teeth of children, the teeth that fall out. And he collected thousands of teeth and analyzed them, and he found strontium replacing calcium in the teeth. And so strontium-90 is a radioactive element that is chemically very, very similar to calcium. It's the next in the series. So this became a big issue, right? That the children in the milk, they were getting strontium from the fallout, and it was coming into their bones. And so the publicity around fallout resulted in the banning of above-ground nuclear testing in the United States. Otherwise, it would not have happened. The military loved it. You could get soldiers out there, expose them to a little radiation, teach them how to act in case of limited nuclear warfare, which the military was planning. But they were forced to stop it. So you see, it's not so simple. Huh? The public gets involved even in things like that. So my baby teeth were in that state.
You're at the democratic rationalization sounds similar to the social studies of science, which argues about public participation in science. But I think in such studies in STS, social studies of science, I found that laypersons and experts are confronting. Still, they are confronting in such arguments, and I think your idea is more than that in suggesting the two kinds of instrumentalization which cannot be separated from each other. But I'm not quite sure about how can such confronting relations between layperson and experts can be resolved with your ideas in real practice.
Well, of course, you need to think in terms of translation, because if a layperson says, say, people say, there are many people getting illnesses in this community, and we think it's because there's a landfill nearby. What's in that landfill? What kind of garbage is in there? Maybe it's poisoning us. Then this is a common, not an uncommon situation, right? Then this has to be translated into the terms of a technical discourse. You know, in that landfill, a certain chemical company dumped a certain chemical which is known to be a neurotoxin, and it's been found in the groundwater, and so there's a whole technical discourse which translates the complaint and gives it a rational form in the terms of science and government, so that action can be taken by those institutions. But you know, if there were no need for the complaint, because scientists and governments were so alert that every time anything went wrong, they were always there, well, that would be wonderful. But that's not the world we live in, right? So then the question is there any cognitive content to the complaint of the community? It's not formulated in scientific terms. They don't know the names of the chemicals. They can't prove that they really do have a higher rate of lymphoma or something than they should. And yet they think they know something. Right? I think that's a kind of knowledge. This is what Foucault called a subjugated knowledge, a connaissance assujettie, which is the knowledge of the underlings, right? The people on the bottom. They see the world differently. So in this case, maybe all that's happening is they see something first that any expert could have identified. But no one told the expert to go there, right? So it wasn't identified until these people developed their own kind of knowledge based on rumors, on intuitions, but still you can't just dismiss it because it's often right. Workers know so much that the managers never seem to take seriously, and then there's an accident, and then suddenly, the workers on that platform that BP built in the Gulf, they knew enough so that had their worries been taken seriously by the management, they would not have. So, but they weren't the, super scientific experts. They were guys who knew about cement and about. So, do you understand the?
But I think rationalization in some part requires some kind of expertise.
Yes.
Then.
But democratic rationalization requires both the experience of ordinary people and the expertise of scientific and technical personnel. The two must come together. And they come together through the process of translation. And sometimes scientists will help a community. For example, there was a company that wanted to put a toxic waste incinerator, an experimental toxic waste incinerator, next to the University of California in San Diego, where I was living. And the scientists from the university, the public didn't like this idea. They didn't like the idea of truckloads of toxic waste coming through their community to deliver to this incinerator, and the smoke from it landing on their community, and possible accidents, right? There are schools nearby and education institution like a university. They didn't like this idea. So there were people in the community who met up with people in the university who did things like study the way wind blows, and because it's important. If the wind would blow the vapor out to sea, that's not a problem. But if it blows it toward the university, so they formed a kind of alliance. On the other side, the company had its experts, right? So you can see there's two different lay groups: the company and its stockholders and their experts, the people and the university experts, and there's a communication process that takes place. It's a kind of negotiation. That's one form in which this can happen.
Yeah. If I take a question next to yeah.
Okay.
Well, I'm going to ask.
Okay.
We won't go before you get a chance.
To take advantage of being a moderator. Well, in terms of daunting, I feel like your writings are always daunting, and I'm not quite sure whether I get every piece of your argument in the paper. But the two observations which are very interesting to me, and one is underneath of your arguments and the thesis, you have a very optimistic view on democratic movement or democracy, and it's probably out of your experience, or probably out of your view on history, society, and everything, and that's quite interesting to me. And then the second observation is your take on social constructivism, and you give a good comment on it, but I think very cleverly found the missing points of irrelevant actors, and so I'm just wondering how to identify irrelevant actors versus relevant actors. Is it always easy to make a boundary or make a identification? And the second is how to, if you can identify and isolate irrelevant actors, how to study them? I mean, how to give our all trust to them? I mean, overall, you gave in question and answers, you gave many examples of many good examples or positive examples that the mass or society or citizens will gave a positive outcome. But there are some cases where internet been used in a very ugly way, and a group of bloggers sort of twisted something, and these days there are a famous case of a singer whose academic credential as a graduate of Stanford University were being attacked over and over again, and so I'd like to basically I share with your optimism about the people, but sometimes what you call the irrelevant actors.
They should stay irrelevant.
Right. Yeah. So I'm just curious about your.
Well, the way you find out about irrelevant actors is when they make themselves heard by protesting. Right? Then I think of it in terms of latent groups. Right? The technical network, we think in sort of Latourian terms. The network associates people and things, but not all the people associated with the network are aware that they're associated with the network. They may be part of a network without knowing it. So that then there's a latent community that is formed by that unconscious association. So, and of course, we are connected to so many of these Latourian networks. I mean, we're sitting in this room. We're connected to the people who made the tables, right? We're connected to the workers who built the building and who may have made some mistake 10 years ago that will cause it to collapse on us. I mean, we're connected to the people who bottled the water. We're connected constantly in so many ways. Well, so there are latent potentials for group formation everywhere, which connect us to different people. But most of those groups stay latent, and that's fine. We don't want to know who put the water in the bottle, and we're perfectly happy with him in his place. But when things go wrong, then those latent groups are activated, and then irrelevant actors become relevant actors and attempt to weigh in on the design of the systems and their operation and so on. So I think of that as generally positive. That is democratizing. It's not democratic in the sense that it represents the majority vote or something like that, but it's democratic in the sense of the public sphere as a domain of self-expression that has impacts and so on. People should have some rights with respect to the things that affect them. Right? That's democracy in the broadest sense. So, of course, people make all kinds of mistakes, do bad things. Democracy is exposed to manipulation. I mean, ever since Plato, right? We've known this. So you can't say that democracy is ideal, but the alternatives always seem worse. I mean, think about this, the sad story of pollution in the Soviet Union. I mean, there was a country where it was illegal to protest against. So latent groups could not form. As soon as they formed, the people who led them were put in mental hospitals or sent into prison, and everyone was intimidated and scared, so the protest was impossible. So what's the result? The most polluted country in the world. Right? Whereas in normal countries, where there's some kind of, even maybe not a very good democracy, but at least the right to complain, there are controls, there are some checks. You can begin to see what's happening in China, right, in this light, right? Where they're, although it's often illegal to protest and people are sometimes punished, there's enough scope for protest that there are correctives. So, like milk is now purer in China than it was a few years ago because of. So, you can't poison people with impunity to the extent that you used to be able to any longer. Well, I mean, that's irrelevant actors, becoming relevant, latent groups being activated. It's really essential to the development of modern societies. The idealized image of this perfect technocratic elite that sees all the problems and solves them, and forget it. It's not what it's like.
Well, it seems like there are tons of questions, especially from the graduate students.
At least one more.
But Dean Kim pointing out the time because we have reserved the restaurant, and I think there is a lunch meeting with Professor Greenberg, so you can take advantage of that. And so, thank you very much.
Thank you.